Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at the coming of the Industrial Revolution in the US. So last year we covered the Industrial Revolution on the perspective of the whole world. Now we're going to look at it in the perspective of the United States. So Great Britain started the Industrial Revolution, as you remember from last year. And a big reason that Great Britain started the Industrial Revolution is because of its natural resources: coal, iron, forests, fertile land that provide material for industrial growth, grains that provided food for urban workers and residents, a lot of human talent and labor. There was a lot of immigration coming from Ireland and Germany, capital, which was money used for investment. Wealthy people were taking their profits and loaning it as business investments, and the Protestant work ethic encouraged investment. So one of the biggest inventions was John Kay's flying shuttle in 1733 for weaving and thread, and then same with James Hargreaves' spinning jenny in 1764, and Richard Arkwright's water frame in 69. Then came James Watt's steam engine, Crompton's spinning mule, and Cartwright's power loom to industrialize the making of cloth and fabrics. The cotton gin was also developed by Eli Whitney in 1793, which allowed for efficient separation of cottonseed from cotton fiber, which made growing cotton profitable. It revived slavery in the South and increased the demand for land to grow cotton. It provided cheap cotton for northern factories and allowed America to compete with Britain. America then became the first industrialized nation in the Western world, and it was first and foremost because of war. America's primary source of income after the War for Independence was international trade, and because of the Embargo Act of 1807 and the War of 1812, America became an industrialized nation. New England will be the first area to industrialize, and the first successful mechanized textile factory was in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. This factory only mass-produced one part of the textile, which was thread. Then three Bostonians revolutionized the textile industry by mechanizing all stages of textile production. Lowell, which was named for their deceased partner, became a booming manufacturing center, and young women came there to find jobs because their family farms were in decline, which we saw the same thing happening in Europe. Women were used as the laborers because they could be paid less, children were used because they were small and cheap, and working conditions were fairly dangerous. You have the rise of strikes and labor unions in the 1830s. So you can see City Hall in Massachusetts and the industrialization. Internal improvements happening in the world include the first steam locomotive being built in 1825. Railroads were important because they were faster and more economical. Railroads were cheaper and easier to build than canals and opened the entire interior to transportation, which allowed for the growth of towns away from waterways. And it also encouraged immigration and migration to labor sources. Then many states built turnpikes, where travelers paid a toll for access, and they were generally privately owned and operated. Lancaster Turnpike was the first one in the U.S. in the 1790s. The National Road began in 1811 in Cumberland, Maryland, and by 1838 it reached Illinois. It connected Maryland to Illinois and was built with federal money. This helped to stimulate Western trade and development. Then came the first working steamboat by Fulton, and it made travel on the Mississippi River easier, and it led to the development of river cities and increased farm production in the West. The Erie Canal was known as a project as the Big Ditch. It was 363 miles long, and it was a dream of former anti-federalist DeWitt Clinton. It took about 8 years to build, and by 1825 it linked the Hudson River and New York City with the Great Lakes. Other states saw how successful this was and began building, and by 1837, over 3,000 miles of canals were built throughout the U.S. It dramatically reduced the cost of shipping goods, and New York City became a leading American city for trade. Chicago, Buffalo, and Cleveland also became very important as they were along the Great Lakes. So now we're going to look at Supreme Court decisions in this time period. Okay, so in 1795, the Georgia State Legislature passed a land grant which awarded territory to 4 companies. The following year, the legislature voided the law and declared that all rights and claims under it were invalid. In 1800, John Peck acquired land that was part of this original legislative grant. He then sold the land to Robert Fletcher 3 years later, saying that the land sales were legitimate. Fletcher argued that since the original sale of the land was invalid, Peck had no legal right to sell the land and therefore committed a breach of contract. So Fletcher versus Peck was a Supreme Court case in 1810 that said that states could not void a contract in response to popular pressures, and it invalidated a state law that conflicted with the Constitution. So this reiterated the idea that the Constitution was the supreme law over everything. Next came Martin versus Hunter's lessee in 1816. During the American Revolution, Virginia created laws allowing the state to seize the property of loyalists. We talked about this before. Denny Martin, a British subject, inherited land from his uncle, a loyalist. The following year, the Virginia legislature voided the land grant and transferred the land back to Virginia. Virginia then granted a portion of this land to David Hunter. A federal treaty dictated that Lord Fairfax was entitled to the property. The Virginia Supreme Court upheld Virginia's law permitting the confiscation of property, even though it conflicted with the federal treaty. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed and remanded, holding that the treaty trumped state law. So basically, this decision was about the Supreme Court having the right to review decisions of state courts that dealt with constitutional questions. Next was Dartmouth College versus Woodward. New Hampshire's legislature tried to change Dartmouth College's charter to stop the college trustees from electing their own successors. So in 1816, the state's legislature created a new board of trustees for the college. The original group of trustees said, whoa, wait a minute, no. So they sued to block the move. Marshall said that the college's original charter was a valid contract that the state legislature had impaired. Marshall and Webster's arguments reduced the influence of the democratic popular spirit that was developing during this time. So basically, Marshall said that states could not interfere with contracts or businesses, which then allowed for the development of corporations. Daniel Webster argued the case for Dartmouth, and he eventually became a leading figure in the Senate. Next is McCulloch versus Maryland. This is a really big deal case. So there were branches of the Bank of the U.S. in each state, including Maryland. Maryland's state legislator levied a heavy tax on the local branch of the Bank of the U.S. in Baltimore. McCulloch, the branch manager, refused to pay the tax and sued the state of Maryland. So it basically was saying that the state didn't want to pay this tax, or the bank didn't want to pay this tax to the state. So Maryland's law was overturned, stating that the states were not allowed to tax the federal government. Marshall declared that the Bank of the U.S. was constitutional. John Marshall stated that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and that federal laws are the supreme law of the land. Next came Cohens versus Virginia in 1821. An act of Congress authorized the operation of a lottery in the District of Columbia. The Cohen brothers proceeded to sell D.C. lottery tickets in the state of Virginia, which violated Virginia state law. State authorities tried and convicted the Cohens and then declared themselves to be the final arbiters of disputes between the states and the national government. So this established the precedent that the Supreme Court had the authority to review state court decisions. And then finally, another big one, Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824. Aaron Ogden received a license from New York legislature to run a ferry between New York and New Jersey. Thomas Gibbons then opened his own steam line in the same area under a 1793 federal law that regulated coastal trading. Ogden took Gibbons to court, and the Supreme Court said interstate commerce could be regulated only by the federal government. It's not fair for individual states to try to regulate it. Ogden's exclusive right granted by the state of New York was not legal because it crossed state lines. And then Congress was given exclusive authority over interstate commerce, known as the Commerce Clause. This led to the regulation of telephones, telegraphs, oil companies, etc., which is why we have federal regulation of like cable companies and the internet today.